So welcome everybody to this UCU event. This is the first in a series of webinars. And in the first of these, which we're doing today, the idea is to take stock of where we are in terms of the LGBT+ liberation agenda and where we're going. I should have introduced myself at the beginning. My name is Ryan Prout. I'm the chair of the UCU LGBT+ committee. So the outline of the event today is that we will have 6 speakers. Each speaker is going to speak for between 8 and 10 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. So please save up your questions and comments until the end of the event, and I believe some of those have been sent in, so we'll also be able to see some pre-sorted questions on the screen. You can't see him, but in the background, the UCU official for LGBT+ equality is managing the technical side of things, and we'll probably hear from Seth more at the end of the event. And before I forget, I'd just like to thank Seth for arranging this and also for making the arrangements for the speakers. To get things going, we're going to hear from Vicky Blake, who is the current UCU president. So over to you, Vicky.
Thanks very much, Ryan. And I'm just so glad and honoured to be here and for us to have such an excellent and inspirational lineup of speakers for everyone that's here together this evening, and for everyone who's watching this later on if you couldn't make it with us live. I was having a look at the work that we've done in this union since its inception. So UCU came into being around 2006-07. And the work that this union has been doing since its inception around LGBT+ equality and liberation is quite significant. And I really think it's worth us emphasising that commitment to seeing where we are, seeing what we need to be doing, and identifying the work that we have to do and that we all have to be part of has been there and is still there, and is really a core thread of the work that this union does. It's not simply something that we cover every now and again, or that we wait for there to be a special week or a special month, that this really is about equality and liberation for all. And so this event today is a fantastic marker to look at where we are, to look at the progress that we have made towards LGBT+ equality and liberation. And I think it's really important that we keep emphasising the and liberation. And it's doing so with an intersectional lens, but also is looking ahead and asking, what is the work that we all need to be doing? What is the work that we need to be holding ourselves as a union, as an institution to account for? What is the work that we as individual members and as collective groups of members need to be holding ourselves accountable for? And I can't think of a better lineup of speakers to get us going with this than those that we have here with us this evening. There is a huge amount of work that has gone into this webinar. As Ryan has said, Seth and our other staff at UCU have done an incredible amount of work in putting this together. And there is also a lot of work that's gone into this preparation from the committee and from the people who have put together the work that you're going to hear presentations on this evening. That is a huge outlay of research, of activism and grit represented in everything we're going to hear about tonight. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm really excited to hear what everyone has to say, to hear the discussion, and I'm just so honoured and glad to be here and to be able to learn from everyone who's going to be contributing to this webinar this evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Vicky, and for starting off the series of interventions that follow. The first speaker in the lineup for this first of this webinar series is Maria Exile. Maria is the chair of the Trade Union Congress LGBT+ committee, and it's worth mentioning in that regard that in 2020 the TUC Congress passed a motion in full support of trans and non-binary rights. And in her intervention this afternoon, Maria is going to address the role of trade unions in establishing LGBT+ rights today, and how an agenda can be taken through the union structures. So over to you, Maria.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much, Ryan, for that introduction. And and very pleased to be joining you for your discussion about mapping the progress on LGBT+ rights. As Ryan says, it's totally the right time to take stock of where we are, where we're going, and what we need to do. In terms of progress, on one level, we could say, of course, there's been progress on LGBT+ rights. If you're looking back to the early 1970s, the Gay Liberation Front, all the social attitude changes that happened all through the 80s, and I always think the film Pride is a very good example of the debates around that time, and also the massive changes in our legal rights that happened after the Labour government in the late 1990s. And now we're in a situation where, with some exceptions, which I think we should discuss here today, we've actually got comprehensive LGBT+ rights. But it's the same, really, as our comrades who are active in BME communities and in women's communities. You may have the Sex Discrimination Act, but there's still a lot of sexism. Of the Race Relations Act, there's still a lot of racism. And we've got comprehensive rights in many areas, but there's a hell of a lot of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia out there. There is evidence. We can see it, even though I think that's going to be the subject of some people's presentations, the fact that we haven't got as much data on our situation as other groups have. But there is evidence that, unfortunately, in the workplace, there are serious issues for LGBT+ workers. A comprehensive survey done a few years ago by Manchester University, one of the first of its kind, looking into sexual orientation and the bullying around it, found that gay men were twice as likely to suffer bullying at work, and L and B women 2.5 times as likely. There are loads of other things found out about that survey, the role of unions, the role of employers' organisations, but the facts are quite stark and show we've got a long way to go. The TUC did a groundbreaking survey just the other year on sexual harassment of LGBT+ people, and it found very similar facts, that when it comes to sexual harassment in the workplace, gay men experience sexual harassment disproportionately, and lesbian, bisexual women experience it even more disproportionately, and trans people have a really bad time of it. So the evidence is out there of, despite having our legal rights, we've got a hell of a long way to go. And why should we be surprised? To make rights real, we have to have action. We have to have action with our fellow workers. There's also evidence out there outside of the workplace that, despite having civil rights, there are problems. There are islands of prejudice against us out there in society, and they can easily be ignited. And I think when we're in an era where it's highly likely in the next few months that we're going to have a massive increase in unemployment and instability, we should be very, very aware of that. We've seen hate crime go up after Brexit. We've seen the big backlash and so-called culture wars, with trans people unfortunately being in the front line on that issue, but a backlash against all of us. The issue for us as trade unionists is how we unite working people so bigotry doesn't divide and rule. It's really, really important, the role of trade unions like yours, UCU, and all other unions in actually being the drivers of equality and justice in the workplace, so we can cut through the rubbish that divides us against each other, and don't let ourselves be used as a way of stopping equality. I think we also have to recognise, those of us who are LGBT trade unionists, that our fight is political. We can see at the moment, with the backlash that's going on around trans rights and, the so-called culture wars, where actually cases are being taken to chip away at our rights that have already been won, and that those cases and a lot of the campaigning that's been the bigotry in the campaigning has been funded by right-wingers, both in the UK and worldwide. We know that there are people who have an agenda to have a go at our rights and to divide us as a working people. When I was given the brief for this speaking, I was asked to sort of identify areas where we think we need to make progress. And I mean, there's a lot that can be said, but I was going to just identify 3 areas, I think, where we really need to do a lot more work. The first is the intersectionality between LGBT and race issues. I think the Black Lives Matters movement has been one of the most important social movements we've seen in the last few decades. And I think the intersectionality between that movement and LGBT rights, especially high profile around defending Black trans rights, are really, really important. And there's got to be a lot more work done there, including us asking quite difficult questions, those of us who are LGBT, about racism within our communities. The second area I think that's really key is around faith-based homophobia, biphobia and transphobia. There are still, that is one of the areas, unfinished legal rights. There are religious exemptions to issues around employment rights. And the TUC and other unions have fought hard against those exemptions, but they still exist. One of the areas where they are pernicious is in the area of education. And we've seen, haven't we, about how that fault line, if you like, between faith groups and LGBT communities can be exploited in Birmingham with all the protests outside the schools. But what is a good thing, I think, is the fact that there's been a lot more visibility of people who are LGBT people of faith and how they've taken a part in those discussions, most particularly the LGBT Muslims in the Birmingham area who campaigned hard on that issue. I myself have been involved in some of the campaigning in this cutting edge area, and it's really important that we see the multi-faith dimension of LGBT people of faith from the Jewish community, Muslim community, Christian communities, and Sikh communities. I could go on into communities. They're out there. We're all out there, and we need to make sure our voices are heard. The last area I was going to say is really important is the area where where there really needs to be legal equality, and that's in the area around trans rights and non-binary people's rights. We know that there's still the medical model in there, the cruel way in which people have to jump through hoops in order to get gender recognition, and the absurdity that many people who are non-binary are met when people feel challenged by them. Thinking outside the box, outside the narrow categories, that's an area that we really need to work on. Just wanted to say a little bit about that because it has been very heated debates, and I know it's happened in your sector and it's happened politically around the world. The idea that that women's rights in any way challenge trans rights and that trans rights in any way challenge women's rights. Give me a tenner for every time I've said, and lots of other people I know have said, there is no contradiction and we'd be rich people. But I think that we need to recognise where there are problems. There are clearly within feminism today heteronormative anxieties that are playing out. A vast majority of people who are feminists are trans inclusive, but there are a small group of people who wish to exploit some of the anxieties within feminism, and that's maybe something that needs to be dealt with primarily within feminism. And secondly, the evidence that from the campaigning around against transphobia, that actually those of us who stand up as trans allies, lesbian, bisexual and gay men, that actually we discovered that there's quite a lot of homophobia and biphobia linked with those debates too, and it's exposing them. And maybe it shows us that we're not as tolerant a society as we think we are. Pleased to say that the TUC has taken a strong binary equality at the virtual TUC Congress that happened just earlier on this year. Just finish on this. As a socialist feminist, I do despair about the way in which things are divided, and the trans debate so-called debate is an area of that. But there's something that goes very deep in that, the idea that rights can be played off against each other, that in some way we should all be claiming our little bit of territory in order to mainstream our rights. And again, I'm for campaigning for rights, I'm not against it, but in the end we have to look at where we're going and what it's all about. And I think Vicky said this point, don't forget the liberation. The issues of our LGBT plus liberation isn't just for us claiming our spaces, but for the whole of society. Our aim should be for a lot more liberated society for everybody, for straight people, for all parts of our community, LGBT plus parts of our community. That's what it's about. That's part of the socialist vision. It's part of the transformation of our society, that we have an important role to play, and us as LGBT trade unionists and campaigners have an important part to play. I'll leave it there, Ryan. Hand over back to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maria. And having had a look at some of the questions that came in prior to the seminar beginning, I think in several parts of your contribution, you touched on issues that are quite close to people's concerns. So hopefully we'll be able to come back to you in the questions and answers section. You touched on questions of visibility, and I think that leads nicely into the contribution from our next speaker, Jordan Daley, who is one of the co-founders, I think, of the charity and campaigning group Time for Inclusive Education. And following the note that I have here, Jordan, I think you're going to be talking to us about how the organisation that you work with was instrumental in bringing in questions of LGBT history to the curriculum in Scotland. I hope that's right, and over to you.
Yeah, no, that's correct. That's correct. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Jordan Daley. I'm not sure. I'm trying to share just a short presentation, but I'm not entirely sure if you can see it. So I'll just. Oh, we can see it. Perfect. Yeah. So my name is Jordan Daley. I am one of the co-founders of TIE, also known as Time for Inclusive Education. And we began as a campaign group in 2015, and our fundamental aim and ethos has always been really, really simple, very, very clear. We believe that in order to tackle homophobia, biphobia and transphobia in our schools, from bullying to otherisation of LGBT young people and young people perceived to be LGBT, to stigma, stereotypes and prejudice in school communities, that we should be integrating LGBT and equalities education within schools, from broad general education right through to senior phase. And I'll go into kind of my experience in just a little bit at school and where some of the kind of drive for starting the campaign came from. But our whole kind of ethos around LGBT inclusive education is that LGBT history, LGBT role models, equalities, human rights education should be integrated into the learning pathway in all public schools for all young people, and including LGBT themes within learning content. It can address stigma and prejudice and the otherisation that leads to bullying behaviour. So it's taking an educational approach to addressing the roots of prejudice and the roots of bullying before they arise and materialise within a school environment. So we, since 2015, have campaigned for this. We have worked with national decision makers in the Scottish Parliament and in Westminster in London. We've worked with local authorities. We have worked with a broad coalition of cross the social organisations. We deliver services in schools. We develop curriculum and teaching resources, some of which we'll talk you through in this short presentation today. But the big moment for our work came in 2018, 3 years after we set up our campaign. The Scottish Government accepted 33 policy recommendations that were made to them as part of a working group, which we requested was set up, and which we were members of and remain members of. They accepted those recommendations in full, and that paper is available online on our website. I'll link to it at the end. But it's a very, very comprehensive framework as to how we implement LGBT inclusive education in our schools, from curriculum changes to the development of resources, to teacher training, to school inspections. There's a lot in there, and those recommendations were accepted in full by the Scottish Government in November 2018, and at the time Scotland became the first country in the world to agree to embed LGBT inclusive education in all public schools. So that was a huge moment for us, and you know, in hindsight, a massively historic moment for the country. Not really something we could appreciate too much at the time. I remember watching it happening in Parliament and being debated and discussed and then finally announced. And we were excited, but we were also aware that there was a huge amount of work that had to be done following that announcement. You know, government announcements do not a culture change make. It's the implementation and the policy work that comes off the back of it that's extremely important. In terms of my experience at school, so I think, like I'm sure maybe some of the other panelists this evening and many of the people watching, my school experiences and my school years are not my fondest memories. I'm 25 now. I'm gay. I am, very proud to be part of a community that has such a rich culture, such a rich history, has so much achievement and progress, and has overcome so much stigma and prejudice and discrimination over the decades. I'm proud to be part of the LGBT community, but I haven't always felt that way. I realised that I was gay probably when I was around about primary 7 in school. I'm not sure what the equivalent is for primary 7 in the rest of the UK, but it's around about 11, 12 years old. And it was the transition for me between primary school and secondary school. And like many, most LGBT people who my experience at school was quite difficult. It was plagued by homophobic language. A lot of slurs were used. Anyone who deviated from, traditional gender stereotypes, what a boy should be, what a girl should be, was called gay, was bullied. And I had all of those experiences. And throughout my time at school, I actually only learned that the word gay meant what it meant probably when I was about 12. To me, the word gay meant negative or bad. It was an insult, it was poor, and it's the perceptions and the messaging that comes with that use of language. And what that told me growing up in an environment where that kind of language was used and those anti-LGBT slurs were used in a pejorative way, it told me that being gay or being LGBT was not okay, it wasn't acceptable, it was wrong. Sometimes that was explicitly told to me at school. And that pushed me quite quickly into a kind of pathway of quite a deep self-hatred that took me quite a long time to overcome. And it took me a long time to accept who I was, took me a long time to be happy with who I was. And I was in quite a dark place for quite a long time, which I won't really go into too much detail about. But the experiences that I had at school are of bullying, of isolation, of feeling excluded, of that sinking feeling in your stomach when you would walk the corridors and see the people that were calling you these homophobic slurs, of not seeing yourself reflected in your learning, of not knowing who you were or knowing anyone who had come before you from your community. For the longest time, I thought that it was just me that had that experience, and it wasn't until well into teenage years that I realised that there are LGBT people for generation upon generation who have had that same experience at school. And in 2015, when myself and Liam Stevenson set up TIE, it was really on the principle that that's not good enough. We should not have those experiences. Even now I can do conferences. When we could do conferences in person, you would chat to people afterwards and I would share my story, and you would have LGBT people who were in their 60s or their 40s or their 30s, years older than me, who were saying I had the exact same experience as you did at school. And for generations that has been allowed to fester. It has been, predates Section 28. It is also the legacy of Section 28, and it's not good enough. It's not equal access to education, and no LGBT young person should have to experience what so many of us have experienced at school. So in Scotland, with the work that we are doing and the achievement that we managed to pull off in 2018, we hope that no other generation of LGBT young people that's coming up after us, my little sister Sienna is 3, and I hope that by the time that she gets to primary school, and by the time she goes through her education, that homophobic language won't be used, that she won't be bullied because she has a gay brother, or she won't be bullied because she has LGBT friends, or if she herself grows up to be LGBT, that she won't be ridiculed or made to feel guilty or ashamed of that in her time at school. And the work that we do for those generations who are coming up behind us, that they can have a better experience than many of us did. And that is very much rooted in the resources that we produce for schools. We focus on several different themes. So LGBT history is included, but it's also about equalities education, ensuring that LGBT young people understand their rights, that they know about the Equality Act, ensuring that all young people receive an education about the roots of prejudice, how it materialises, how you can address it, how to understand, identify and recognise homophobia, biphobia and transphobia. But the resources that personally I think would that we produce that I think would have helped me quite a lot are the resources like this one here, our Icons Who Made LGBT History curriculum resource. It's a companion resource for teachers and educators. It's designed for primary and secondary schools, but it is used in further education here in Scotland. It has lesson ideas, and the resource includes a whole plethora of LGBT people from throughout history, past and present, who have had great achievements and really built the society and the culture that we live in. And the principle and the ethos of the resource is to provide young people with real life examples of role models who have overcome prejudice and bullying and discrimination, and to let young people know, to let LGBT young people know that they're not alone. You know, when I was at school, I thought I was the only person who felt this way. I thought I was a weirdo. I thought I was a freak. There are so many LGBT young people who still feel like that today. And I came out, I thank God, when I was 13. It wasn't until I got to about 16 or 17 that I was actually comfortable with who I was, and that I understood why the LGBT community used the word pride. And it was because I had watched the documentary How to Survive a Plague. And it's about the activities and the activism of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in New York City, ACT UP. And I watched that documentary, and I remember just sitting up like all night and crying and thinking, wow, like I have never ever seen people like me, you know, who have overcome what that community of people has overcome. And for the first time, I remember just sitting, I always remember it, I remember sitting in bed at like 4 a.m, floods of tears, and thinking, I get this now, like I understand why we talk about being proud. And it was learning more about LGBT history and the people who came before us that really helped me feel confident in myself. And you know, we want to impart that on young people today. We want young people to know about people like Bu Ann Temple, who protested against Section 28 and stormed into the BBC studios interrupting a live protest. We want them to know about people like Christine Burns, who has just done absolutely incredible work for transgender legal recognition in the UK, to know about people like Alan Turing, and Oscar Wilde. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, was a lesbian. Maureen Colquhoun, our first known lesbian member of Parliament here in Britain. Sylvia Rivera, Lady Phil. Young people deserve to have these role models in their lives, and they deserve to know that they are okay. And that's the ethos and the principle of the work that we do in schools. I can see, I think that Seth has come back maybe. So I'll wrap up just a little bit. But one of the most recent things that we have worked on over the lockdown period that I would definitely recommend that you all read and take a look at is a research paper that the co-founder of TIE, Liam, worked on during the lockdown period, online in lockdown. And it presents the findings of research carried out throughout the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown in Scotland over a 6-week period, from the beginning of lockdown through 6 weeks. As far as we know, it's the only data set in the UK which specifically explores young people's emotional well-being, their experiences of online bullying and their experiences of online prejudice. 1,015 young people took part from every local authority area in Scotland, and there are breakdowns by LGBT, by gender, by school pupil and by further education. And what we found in this report was that online bullying had increased during the lockdown period, that online prejudice had massively increased during the lockdown period, and that the most common forms of prejudice witnessed by young people online were related to homophobia, racism, and body image. 56% of LGBT young people witnessed homophobia online, and 48% witnessed transphobia online. And LGBT young people also saw homophobia online at more than double the rate of young people who identified as heterosexual, whereas they saw biphobia and transphobia online at more than triple the rate. Now, we are just beginning to move into this environment to really explore what is happening online. We're developing responses to this, but this big question that's hanging over this seminar just now around where do we have to go, as the previous speaker so eloquently said, some of us in this community might have very strong legal rights, some of us might have protections from discrimination, but what how can we say that we live in an equal and a tolerant and an accepting society if I, as a 25-year-old gay man, can't pick up my phone without reading the worst homophobic messages, without our charity being compared to paedophiles and being accused of being child groomers and abusers because we are an LGBT charity that works in schools. My trans friends who have taken themselves off of social media because of the vitriol and abuse that they receive. I don't think it's good enough. And what we all experience online, so too do our young people, and so too do LGBT young people. And that's an area that we are definitely interested in developing responses to, and we'll be beginning to work on, because we can't address homophobia, biphobia, transphobia in schools if it is allowed to fester and permeate in online spaces that our young people are using. I'm going to just leave this up on the screen just as we finish, because I think my kind of final remark would be the whole ethos behind LGBT inclusive education here in Scotland and now in other parts of the world is to ensure that every single LGBT young person that is coming up behind us knows that they're not alone, knows that they have rights, knows that that they are able to be themselves, and have the role models and the people that they can look to and learn about the community that they're part of, and learn about the people that have come before them, to let them know that being LGBT isn't a barrier, and irrespective of what's happening for them just now, that they will overcome this, and that there are people out here who, like all of these people on the screen that we can see before us now, there are people out here, all of us, I'm sure, on this call, who are fighting for a better world and the better future that tomorrow's generations deserve to grow up in. So happy to take any questions at all when it comes to LGBT inclusive education, but I will sign off just now, and thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you, Jordan, very much for both sharing that information about what TIE does and the details you gave us about your recent research on the experiences of lockdown for LGBT people, and also for sharing your personal experiences. And I think it's great to see a focus on a future when there won't be anti-LGBT prejudice in the education system, and also very salutary to realise that for the moment this is something that is still happening and is still affecting people. Now we're moving on in the next contribution to think about legal gender, and the speaker we're going to hear from next is Flora Rins, who's affiliated to the University of Kent and is involved with a project which is looking at the future of legal gender. And according to my notes, Flora, you're going to share with us an international perspective on some of these issues, so that we kind of broaden out the scope of today's discussion to bring in this international dimension as well. So over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Ryan, and to you and Seth and Jenny for organising what I think is an incredibly important and timely event to be had at this very moment. As Ryan has said, I'm going to be talking a bit about legal gender in an international context before coming back a bit to the UK and what all of this means for us, really. As Maria has already alluded to, actually, Britain has faced a fairly intense debate about how legal categories of sex and gender should operate, given the increasing numbers of people living in genders that do not align with their sex assigned at birth, and in people living outside of conventional binary gender categories, which has, of course, always been the case, but it's now that we're having sort of more public awareness around this. For instance, the recent consultations about reforms to the Gender Recognition Act 2004 in England and Wales, as well as a separate consultation in Scotland, attracted a huge amount of public attention, including hostility to the very concept of sex or gender as something that can be legally changed. Much of the public attention has centered on how to change procedures for genders recertification, so for changing your marker legally, to anchor it in a model of self-declaration or self-identification, alongside expanding existing legal categories beyond male and female as the sort of two traditional categories that we use. This is at least in part due to the fact that a number of countries have made it easier over the last 10 years for people to change their legal gender marker, or adopt a non-binary gender marker, or have their gender removed from official documentation entirely. Today, I want to briefly consider some of these international approaches, and there's kind of three key types of approaches. before returning to the question of what this means for the future of legal gender status here in the UK. Now, in terms of international approaches and what we can learn from them, Ireland may perhaps offer the closest parallel. They are our neighbours after all. And although the Irish Parliament did not adopt gender recognition until 2015, so until 2015 you could not legally change your gender, the existing law now has enshrined the right for trans individuals to self-declare their own gender in a legal fashion. Once adult applicants in Ireland provide a statutory declaration requesting a permanent change in their legal gender status, they're generally subject to no further preconditions. Some slightly more complicated rules apply for under 18s. This is in line with a number of other primarily European, but not exclusively European jurisdictions that similarly use a self-determination model where we take a person's word for their gender rather than demanding evidence. These include, in addition to Ireland, Malta, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Belgium, as well as Argentina and Colombia. Generally, the argument in favor for self-determination is that this allows trans people to legally change their gender status with minimal state interference and maximum respect for their dignity and privacy, while at the same time ensuring that this is a process that remains under state oversight and is limited to a fairly small number of people. A second approach that has happened in a number of countries over the last 5 to 10 years has been the introduction of third gender markers. Australia is in many ways representative of a number of particularly Western jurisdictions, including parts of Canada, the US, and New Zealand, that permit the use of an X gender marker on various ID documents. The reason why this is an X is sort of a slightly arcane rule to do with passports, because the Aviation Authority basically recognizes X, M, and F and nothing else. Australia was one of the earliest adopters of the X gender marker, and since 2013 has permitted any adult who wishes to do so to use X instead of male or female as a gender marker for all federal documents, including passports. The government guidance specified that X refers to any person who does not exclusively identify as either male or female, and therefore in principle opens this category up to encompass a variety of different gender identities, such as non-binary, agender, genderqueer, gender fluid, all sorts of things. Arguably, an X gender marker could therefore serve as a catch-all for everyone not identifying solely as male or female. However, the Australian government reserves the right to demand various types of evidence to confirm a person's gender identity is genuine. Additionally, the X marker is, at least on an official level, intended to only be available for trans and intersex people or sex and gender diverse people as per the government materials, and does not seem to be intended, for instance, for someone simply wishing to not disclose their gender on official documentation, even though they might identify with male or female in a fairly conventional way. Finally, the third option, and one that's still fairly rare, is the wholesale removal of legal gender status from relevant documents such as birth certificates. For instance, Tasmania in Australia recently moved towards no longer displaying legal gender status on birth certificates as an optional choice. More common forms of decertification that are sort of a bit less outstanding or a bit less notable, but are nevertheless really important, focus on reducing the relevance of gender rather than removing its as a status entirely. This can be, for example, seen in a move towards creating gender-neutral legislation. So legislation is written in a way that doesn't talk about men or women or uses he or she, but instead is written in a gender-neutral way. Or the choice to remove gender as a category from identification documents where this is not seen as necessary. For instance, driving licenses don't list your gender marker, although they are sometimes coded into the long number at the top. In contrast to either a self-determination model or the option to recognize third gender markers, moves towards decertification generally have an effect on everyone or can be accessed by everyone wishing to remove their gender marker, rather than being restricted to trans and non-binary people. However, such efforts at either recognition or decertification tend to function independently of anti-discrimination law, which may or may not protect trans and non-binary people from discrimination in their day-to-day life. And that varies hugely by jurisdiction, particularly in the US, where this varies on a state level very significantly. Now, returning to the UK and England and Wales in particular, because Scottish law works, of course, slightly differently, here, the law has historically taken a slightly inconsistent approach to legal gender, even down to its language, which moves between sex, gender, and all sorts of other things at various times and in various different contexts. This is a fact that was even pointed out by a High Court judge in a recent judicial review case against the Home Office's refusal to introduce ex-passport markers in this country. As such, here, legal gender status derives from each person's birth certificate and the sex noted on this. However, nowadays, this is only of limited relevance in most people's life, as birth certificates are now rarely used as identification documents. They're almost only important to getting your first passport, to getting married, as well as HM Revenue and Customs, funnily enough. The Gender Recognition Act 2004 was introduced specifically to allow trans people to legally change the sex marker on their birth certificate from male to female or vice versa. But it comes with very onerous evidence requirements and is not based on a self-determination model, and therefore is limited in its application and availability to people. At the same time, the Equality Act, our comprehensive piece of anti-discrimination law, protects everyone from discrimination based on their sex, including their perceived sex. It also separately protects people from discrimination on the basis of gender reassignment. Notably, this is a much broader category than just people who have legally changed their sex marker. In fact, it includes anyone who has changed their gender, is currently doing so, or is proposing to do so in the future, which includes both social, medical, and legal forms of what we generally term as transitioning. A recent employment tribunal decision actually found that this category should additionally include non-binary and genderqueer people, which some people had argued for very heavily and now for the first time has been legally recognized, that these people should also be included in this category of gender reassignment, as they technically have moved out of the sex they were assigned at birth. As such, while equality law is fairly broad in its understanding of gender, options for changing one's legal status in England and Wales are relatively limited. And while it is likely that this will be somewhat reformed in the very near future to make the process marginally easier, it is nevertheless envisaged by the state that only binary identified trans people can and should be able to change their gender marker. Now, given international developments that I've outlined at the beginning, it seems likely that the UK will eventually move towards a more self-determination-based model, or the recognition of non-binary identities, or even towards a removal of legal gender status entirely, although these are likely to take some time given the current political climate and given current political priorities. This trend then raises the question of whether beyond simply legally recognizing people as being a specific gender in law, there may also be better ways to tackle gender-based inequality, which of course affects everyone and not just trans and non-binary people. In particular, it may be worth thinking about whether equality law could think of sex and gender not as it currently does, as something that attaches to or belongs to individuals, but rather as the product of wider social structures that produce gender norms and processes that have uneven effects across different groups of people and at different times in their lives. Could we have an equality framework that actually tries to address sexist or even cis-sexist norms rather than just dealing with individual instances of discrimination as it is happening right now? If we had an equality framework that was not solely centered on individuals, could this be used, for instance, to tackle sexist stereotyping of children's toys, of clothing, or the lack of affordable childcare that often prevents women from working full time? I think these are priorities that we should be thinking about sort of in the next 10 or 20 years as we go ahead, and kind of not to lose sight of the important work that equality law does and the work that it might be able to do if we think about it slightly differently. I'm going to leave it at that, and thank you so much to Seamus and Jenny for signing along to all of this.
Thank you, Flora, very much for giving us that very clear outline of the variety of approaches taken in various national jurisdictions to questions of how legal gender is approached, and indeed the wider issues that the nuances of legal gender both reflect and to some extent in a kind of social constructionist way determine. I think that your contribution leads nicely into our next speaker, who is Matson Lawrence, who's affiliated to the University of Strathclyde, and will be talking to us about the Trans Edu project, which has been investigating the experiences of gender and non-binary gender in people, both students and staff, working in HE and FE sectors. So over to you, Matson.
Hi everyone, and thanks so much for having me today. I'm hoping that you can see my shared screen. I'll just wait for that to come up. I'm not going to turn my video on because my internet connection is pretty poor, and it's just about managing with the presentation, but I'll turn it on for the questions afterwards. So yeah, as Ryan says, I'm going to be talking today just to give you a really quick whistle-stop tour of the research that we did on trans and non-binary equalities in colleges and universities in Scotland. And that was research that was based at the University of Strathclyde. I'll just move to that slide. So it was conducted by myself and Dr. Stephanie McKendry, who is Widening Access Manager at Strathclyde between 2016 and 2018. It was funded by the Scottish Funding Council with a bit of extra financial support from the University of Strathclyde and the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education, which is now part of Advanced HE. One of the sort of major aspects of the project was empirical research conducted with trans, binary, gender diverse students and staff in colleges and universities across Scotland, and that's really what I'm going to be just quickly talking you through today, some of the things that we found. We also did a lot of broader sector engagement via workshops, open meetings, conferences, events, and we developed a whole sort of suite of open access resources, videos, some case studies, all of this kind of stuff. So you can find all of that on the website, and you can read a little bit more also about what we found in the research as well. So moving on, just to kind of let you know who we engaged with. So there's 157 participants in the survey, and we did in-depth interviews with 20 people. So we spoke to, through that survey and the interviews, applicants and students from every university in Scotland and 2/3 of Scottish colleges. And there was a wide range of educational levels, so from national fives and highers, which is what we understand in England as GCSEs and A-levels, up to PhD, and there was a really broad range of disciplines as well. In terms of the breakdown, it was about 90% students and about 10% staff. And as you can see from the pie chart, in terms of the people's gender and how they describe their gender, about half were men and women. So about 25% men, 21% women. And I think this is always an interesting point to bear in mind, that actually, at least for the people that we engaged with, over half describe themselves as non-binary, genderqueer, or gender diverse, or agender, or in some other gender diverse way. So I think it's just worth bearing in mind that any sort of policy, practice, provision that's put in place needs to embrace the sort of full diversity of experience. So some of the things that we found, as you can imagine, students and staff experience sort of multiple and significant barriers. This was across sort of administrative barriers, barriers in terms of accessing different types of support, and then a lot of interpersonal barriers, either with peers or colleagues. There was sort of, from a widening access perspective, there was actually quite a fairly high rate of withdrawal. So it would be interesting to do sort of further research in this area to actually see if it is backed up that trans and non-binary people do withdraw from courses more often. And in terms of disclosure, this was another sort of thing that we found, is that people were really uncertain about disclosing that they were trans, basically, and quite a few people just didn't want to talk to their institution about it at all, even in situations where that might have been necessary. So in terms of policy and provision, we found that it was generally reactive rather than proactive. So a lot of the things that were put in place was a case of firefighting. So policies and practices were developed in response to a specific situation or a personal circumstance. That might have been somebody coming out or looking to access support. And often workers and students found themselves having to act as advocates and educators because they were that first person, and having to really advocate and educate about their statutory rights and their needs and experiences. And there was a lot of issues with compulsory disclosure. So the lack of established protocols, for example, changing your name on records, meant that staff and students often had to disclose their trans status multiple times to multiple individuals and departments while they tried to sort of navigate all of those changes. And also there was definitely a sort of element of taking what's given, and there was questions around actually people's awareness of their own rights, and also, as we know from a lot of feminist scholarship as well, the personal and professional risks associated with asserting your rights, and complaint and all of these kind of things. So I think this is one to focus on just because of the sort of current issues in sort of trans healthcare. So almost sort of half of the respondents that we engaged with had made some form of gender-related changes while they're in their current course or job, and 80% of the participants had accessed currently accessed or intended to access the gender identity clinic at some point in order to access gender affirming healthcare. And I think it's important to kind of view that in the context of the trans healthcare crisis, which is currently sort of unfolding across the UK. And waiting times for a first appointment at a gender identity clinic ranges between 2 years, which is sort of average in Scotland, up to 4 or 5 years, which is what you're finding in England. And also in Northern Ireland, the clinics, the adult clinics, aren't taking on any patients at all at the moment. And with trans staff and students, they must often travel long distances to access healthcare interventions, and often at significant personal and financial cost. So, for example, there's no gender affirming surgical interventions delivered in Scotland. So it means that trans staff and students must travel to Manchester, London, Brighton on multiple occasions. Just to sort of look at some specific aspects, and it does touch on what Maria was talking about and what I'm sure Pav is going to talk about soon, which is around different intersections of trans experience and what we found with the research. So about half of the participants described themselves as disabled or as having a long-term health condition, and that broadly aligns, I mean, with the NUS research, the LGBT research. They found sort of similar numbers as well. And we found that one of the big things was the policies and procedures for sickness absence. They don't generally include specific provision or accommodations for people with dual protected characteristics. So if you need time off, for example, because connected to a disability or a long-term health condition, there is not separate provision for time off if you then need time off due to under the Equality Act gender reassignment. So it can mean that people actually have exhausted sick leave entitlements and have not actually been able to access the healthcare they need to access. And also disability and mental health provision was found to be quite lacking for disabled trans people. And in terms of the Black, Asian, minority ethnic and people of colour that we engage with, it was about 8% of the participants, which is sort of on par with numbers in Scotland. And I think one of the big things was the sort of, and this goes to the current conversation as well, the development and funding of the intersectional equality policy, which is really important, and curriculum content that addresses and elevates both race, anti-racism and the decolonizing work, and sexual and gender diversity as aspects of that work too. And also multiple marginalization, exclusions, and inclusion within white majority LGBT spaces and professional networks. And also the vast majority of respondents, over 90%, describe themselves as queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, etc. So I am still here, but the computer is not behaving. What I would do is, I was going to show you a quick video. I have no idea if this will work, so I hope you'll be able to watch this. So this is one of the videos that we developed as part of the TransEdu research. It is captioned, so I'll get the captions put on. It's very short. So we developed 3 videos that were drawn from the research that we did and the conversations we had in the interview context, which we've then re-recorded those conversations with trans and non-binary people who didn't participate. And these are open access, available online if you want to use them for anything. So I'll just pop that caption on.
I have to be careful about what I say in class because sometimes I've got experiences that would be relevant, but they would have me. So I've had to sort of keep my mouth shut, even though
So I'm not sure. I think that the sound wasn't working there. so I'll move on. So the last thing that I'll just talk about today is what can UCU do? I think this is something that's been asked a couple of times, particularly from the UCU Scotland office. We did a wee session with them and conversations with the committee, the LGBT committee last year. So it's just kind of leading on from that. What are the kind of key things that we can focus on? So the first thing was around leave, and that's securing ring-fence leave for staff accessing gender-affirming healthcare, which is separate to sick leave. So that might be something that we can imagine similar to maternity or parental leave for people who are having babies or are adopting. And that is just in reference to what I said earlier in terms of the situation that people find themselves in, where they might have exhausted all of their leave because they've had time off for surgery, and then they might need additional time off for another illness that's related to disability, or even if someone just has the flu. I think in the context of precarity and that people are on fixed term, say a 1-year contract, you might only be entitled to 1 month's leave, and then if you've got a number of different intersecting protected characteristics, you're at a disadvantage in those situations. And often you have to, people have had to dip into their annual leave, they've had to delay access to healthcare, all of these kind of things, so that they can negotiate that being at work. The next thing is pensions, and I think it may potentially would be a simple conversation, who knows, but to establish USS's policy on legal gender and pension rights for USS members without a GRC. So there are clauses in some pension schemes that say that the pension providers have the power to invalidate a pension if there's not been if the person wasn't registered under what their legal gender was at the time. So I think it's to establish what it is with USS, so that members, trans and non-binary members, can be informed as to what they should be doing to protect their pensions, basically. The next one is policy. So it's ensuring institutions have solid policies to formally establish the rights, processes and recourse for trans staff and students. So there's still quite a lot of institutions that don't have a policy, that just kind of puts all of that in one place. And then facilities, again, just having increased single stall, gender neutral toilet and changing facilities. Now that was something that came up a lot in the research. It was really important in the sense of actually having access to these necessary things, but also to kind of reinforce and foster that sense of belonging in the physical environment of the campus. And it's important also, and a lot of the people we interviewed were really keen that this was emphasized, that it's important that they're put in place in addition to the gender facilities and in addition to accessible and changing places facilities. And we've actually got a video about toilets, because people seem to love to talk about toilets. So we've got a video about that on YouTube, which you can access via the trans.act.uk website. The next thing was records. So it was about having institutions providing additional gender, title and name options, including things like a known as name if there's not been a formal change for staff and students, and to really streamline the records changes so that people aren't being passed from department to department, that actually there's a way to do that. And at Strathclyde, how that's been done is having named contacts for trans students, for example. There's one person they can contact within student services who will help them negotiate all of this stuff. The next is the resource development, so resourcing further policy and guidance development and work for branches and members. So I think with that, one of the big things is that I know that there's been a number of branches, for example, who've had a really tough time negotiating all of this sort of stuff, and they've had a really tough time sort of learning how to support trans staff, and maybe sort of also navigating some of the current the discourse which is admittedly happening. So I think in terms of having a little bit more support would be really welcome. And the last thing is leadership, and this is always really important, is in terms of a commitment to trans and non-binary equality at branch, regional and national levels. So I see that it's 5 o'clock now, so I'll leave it over to the next speaker, but thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matson, both for sharing some of the results of TransEdu's research, and also for giving us pointers to those very useful resources, and hopefully we can include some links to those in places where this material is going to be archived. So because we're running slightly over time, I'm just going to go straight to introducing the next speaker, who is Pav Akhtar, who's an equality lead in the NHS and also director of Black Pride, which in its 15th year continues to provide a very important space for people to talk about the intersections of race and LGBT+. So without further ado, because of the time, I'll just hand over straight to you, Pav.
Thank you very much. I'm really, really pleased to be here with UCU colleagues today. My name is Pav Akhtar. Working in the National Health Service, lead on equalities for a couple of trusts. So we're wearing two hats really, as UK Black Pride, but also as an equalities lead in the NHS. The question was really around progress made, so I'm going to start with that. I want to acknowledge that there's been huge progress in terms of the lived experience, but also in terms of the outcomes of LGBT people's access to benefits and services, goods and services in society, and what a massive change that has made to our communities and to our diverse communities. I want to start with that. I also want to acknowledge the work of people like Dr. Joe Grady, your General Secretary at UCU, who I think has been an outstanding ally to the LGBT movement for a very, very long time, long before she became Gen Sec. So I'm really, really pleased about that. UK Black Pride, we are celebrating our 15th anniversary this year, and it's in a context of that 15th anniversary that I think it's worth just having a reflection on that journey and what it's taught us. But I'm going to put that journey in the context of COVID, because my other hat, my life has been consumed by COVID, of course, in the NHS, and the impact of that and what it has. But I think there's huge parallels in terms of whilst society, generally speaking, is healthier and better off, generally is better off. What COVID has done is really sort of brought under a microscope just how fragile and precarious that progress is and has been. And whilst there is an aura of everyone being in a good place or not, I think what COVID has done is really just for me, just amplifies all those inequalities that have existed for a very, very, very long time. I mean, you talk about intersectionalities. There is a perception, and I don't live in the north. I don't live in London. I live in the north of England. Some people have this impression that somehow, being LGBT is a fair and equal reality. It really isn't. There are regional variations. There are health variations. Massive inequalities within our LGBT community that we don't really recognise or talk about enough, in my view. And COVID has really forced us to do that. 60% of those of my colleagues in the NHS who passed away, who contracted COVID and passed away, were from Black and Asian minority ethnic backgrounds. Nearly 2/3 of health workers being BAME who passed away of COVID. We know that Black workers are Black people are around African Caribbean heritage people are about 2 times more likely to contract COVID and be very sick with COVID. And in terms of healthcare for Asian people, the issue for South Asian people, particularly Bangladeshi or Indian people, is around 3 times more likely. So there are huge inequalities within the system. Thinking about LGBT people as a whole, that really has been amplified. I mean, we know that LGBT people's experience when it comes to healthcare in particular is pretty poor. LGBT people tend to be more isolated, and I think the COVID lockdowns nationally, but also regionally. I mean, I'm in Lancashire right now, in the city of Preston, where we are having a local lockdown. And that has really amplified that experience. And what are the consequences of those experiences? It means fewer people able to access regular healthcare. We know that trans and non-binary people have had some of their HRT suspended. We know that for trans communities, around 49% of people, 49% fewer trans people accessing healthcare services, 33% not able to access, of LGBTs generally, LGBT people not accessing their healthcare. So there's been a massive impact on LGBT and T people's ability to access healthcare. We know that those people living in, I work specifically for a mental health and community trust, health trust, access to acute services for LGBT and T people has been really has really suffered. Those inequalities, as I say, existed long before COVID. I mean, COVID has simply amplified that for us. People have touched on legality and trans experiences in healthcare, and I always want to touch on where the NHS is at. I'm not speaking now in a formal capacity. I'm very much in a personal capacity here, but I think the NHS is treading on eggshells. We have had a system of inequalities that structural inequalities both within the health service and our design and delivery of services that is now really being brought to the fore and exposed. We are treading on eggshells left, right and centre. The government has introduced through NHS England a NHS People Plan, which I think is a really good opportunity to try and row back on, try and make some progress and make up some ground on those inequalities and why they've existed. And too often what's happened in the NHS is that we do stuff to people rather than doing stuff with people. We don't, we treat people, we don't co-design services, we don't co-develop those services, we don't really respond to communities sufficiently quickly. And as a consequence, those communities lose out, or that the services aren't tailored to them to meet their needs. And as a consequence of that, those inequalities persist and widen. For the experience for our workforce, we've got around 30,000 out LGBT people within the NHS nationally, out of over 1 million strong workforce. Things are not great for LGBT workers with the National Health Service either. The day-to-day reality of coming in and coming into work and being open and honest about yourselves and your identity is still a struggle for many, many workers in many, many parts of the country. So, when we're looking at progress, it's all relative, of course. Are we better off than we were 20 years ago? Of course we are. Is there still more work for improvement? Of course there is. My concern as a former lawyer, now practicing in the NHS, is this around the legality and ethics one. People, with GRA, and we touched on the GRA and trans issues. I think there's a question around the NHS not providing data to researchers, and part of that is around how legislation has been constructed and the confidentiality built into that, and also people not really understanding how the legislation has been designed and then how to use it. It is a cruel reality, I'm sorry to say, but it's not necessarily that people are opposed to sharing information about transgender people within the system, transsexual people in the system, but it is about their understanding of the systems, and the consequences are that, I'm afraid, LGBT and T communities are suffering through a lack of understanding. I'd say this, in terms of trying to keep it positive, we have to. Sorry if I'm being too pessimistic. The NHS People Plan is going to provide us an opportunity to try and change how things are done. It calls on us as NHS institutions and the NHS as a national service to better engage with our staff, to work with our LGBT, including our LGBT staff, to listen to those communities and to ensure that we are responding to their needs. But also it requires us to work with LGBT and T communities in the community to make sure that the voluntary sector in particular, trade unions as a really key partner of that relationship, are able to help shape what the needs are of our communities, both staff and students and beyond. And I'd say this to the trade unions, and certainly to use that. What has happened, honestly, in lockdown, the mental health, you've seen it at your institutions. It is quite shocking for me. I'm a governor of one trust and I'm a lead equalities in another trust. It's quite shocking to me what's happening in the health system and the lack of funding, the lack of investment. I'm saying this in a personal capacity, of course. the lack of funding, the lack of investment, and the consequences of that. And we are really bearing the brunt of that. So in terms of where we need to go, we really need to be focusing on investing, and particularly in long, not necessarily so much the acute care, because that is one piece, but the mental health piece is really where I think we have the most profound needs that I'm seeing, at least within the LGBT communities. And looking at it from a UK Black Pride perspective, I'll just say this, that, you know, Black communities historically have been on the margins, excluded. You know, it's taken UK Black Pride about 15 years to get into the mainstream. When we first started out, it was, you know, it was a small minibus of Black lesbians going up to Southend, and then the second year it was a coach full of Black lesbians going to Southend, and then we moved now, you know, well, before lockdown, we used to have events of you know, 10,000 plus, which was outstanding in terms of progress, and we've become very mainstream. But we are not blind to how frail and vulnerable and precarious our rights are, because the racism is still rife. I mean, Black LGBT people are still experiencing massive racism. The xenophobia that comes through from the, you know, the Brexit scenario compounds our COVID reality, if you like. The mental health experiences, we know that you know, a lot of we've surveyed internally our own Black and Asian members within the UK Black Pride, and you know, 72% of our respondents said that they were concerned about mental health the most within Black LGBT communities. Our BAME, Black and Asian minority ethnic members, reported serious concerns about their well-being. That was particularly of a concern for our under-19s, for our trans men, and for our cisgender women. We know that around 34% of those of our members who we surveyed told us that they couldn't be open about their sexual orientation in their home environment or in their lockdown environment. And that's really troubling, 3.5 out of 10 people. As I say, I mean, I touched on the number of people who are not able to access healthcare through the formal channels, and there is a digital inequality, which of course has an impact on, you know, I mean, even digital consultations and being open and honest about who you are and what your needs are. That is not always so easy to do in a digital context, in a COVID context. So there are huge challenges for us. Trade unions play a really important part in highlighting some of those concerns. And right now, where we're at, I think it is the mental health crisis, because in the old days, one could go out and have, you know, build social networks. In isolation, that becomes even more difficult. And I am really, really concerned about what the state of play is for people who don't have, you know, birth families who aren't necessarily tolerant or respectful of their LGBT status, so they're having to hide their identities or mask that, and that becomes really, really difficult. So I'll stop on there. Well, I hope I haven't depressed everybody. There is light at the end of the tunnel. You know, the government has made £5 million worth of investment, but it's small money for a great big need.
Thank you very much, Pad, for sharing those insights on the intersections of race and LGBT plus identities, and indeed some insights on what it's been like to work in the NHS over recent months, and drawing attention in particular to some of the disproportionate fallout for the equality strands of the COVID episode. Again, to try and keep to time, I'm just going to go straight on to introducing the next speaker, who is Trudeau Sunbury. And Trudeau is going to share with the webinar some of the initial results from a project that's looking at trying to understand better the experiences of LGBT plus people. I think it's particularly in the higher education sector, isn't it, Trudeau? If I'm wrong, perhaps you can put me right if I hand over to you.
Great, thank you very much to everyone, and in particular to Jenny and Shermas for interpreting. I know we speak quite quickly, and thank you to everyone who's attending today, and UCU for organizing this. So I'm not going to talk so much about the history or the past, but focus much more on starting to get a picture and image of what is going on when it comes to our work environment as LGBT plus staff in higher education. So I'm going to give a very brief top line results of a survey, a pilot survey that we have carried out. And when I say we and talk about the survey today, I'm talking about and on behalf of a research group that is formed of people from the UCU, Essex, Sussex, the University of Kent, and Glasgow Caledonian. And so thank you to everyone else who's been part of creating this survey. So what I'm focusing on in particular will be working conditions, but also our lived experiences as workers within the higher education. And as I said, this is a pilot study. So I'm going to highlight some things that are starting to come out, but there's a lot more detail to be spoken about in the survey. So I will be talking about that at the UCU's conference in December for those of you who wants to hear more, or you can contact me directly if you're curious to hear more about the results. So the results I'm going to talk about are based on 97 interviews across 7 universities in the UK. We've spread them out across the different nations in the country, although I do not include, or I do not have any answers from Northern Ireland, even if I would like to have them, so I'm waiting for that. I wanted to thank the other speakers so far for highlighting a lot of different aspects of what I'm going to talk about, really. And I think the kind of core that comes out in our study so far is to kind of highlight this precariousness of our working conditions. So our focus in this project is thinking of ways in which we can respond to this precariousness, the insecurity, the indirect discrimination that is coming out in the survey, and trying to address this pressure, I can use the word pressure, of us being the responsible to naming the precariousness of being the one who complains, becoming visible, and who is able to do that. So our focus here is to really think about how we can be a counterweight and how we can be an alternative and how we can be part of this liberation in terms of addressing and challenging an increasingly neoliberal and marketized university sector, where the responsibility so often is placed on individuals. So I want to thank UCU once again for being part of this process of creating alternative ways of working and living in higher education. And I think this is something that comes out really strongly so far of what I've looked at in our results, is this pressure that individuals feel to, for example, around outness, to be out, but also the amount of stress that they experience being out. There are stories around bullying, there are stories around stress, and there are stories around performativity, which on its own might seem like small complaints, but when we start accumulating them in a survey such as this, we start seeing a pattern. There's a pattern of LGBT staff, even though we in the main are out, feeling emotional strain and stress by being and doing so. I think in line with that, what we are doing here, and that this is one of the questions I was sent before this presentation, is also making visible the experiences of LGBT plus staff in higher education. What is it that we are experiencing? What kind of discrimination are we experiencing? At what level? And what comes out so far is the amount of indirect discrimination, smaller incidences, which really underlines the importance of studies like this, surveys and research on our working conditions to make this visible. And I think it goes back to what Maria and Flora were talking about, in the sense of how far have we gotten. Well, we've seen changes, legal changes. However, in this survey so far, we're still seeing quite a lot of negative experiences amongst our LGBT plus staff, which means that we have yet to create an environment where we may feel safe to complain, to name, to label these kind of experiences. And so I think, at least from my point of view, this is one of the action points, one of the things that we can also think about in future events, going out of this event, to think about how we can address that and create different kinds of working environments in this sector. In terms of the themes coming out, which I will talk to next, is themes around discrimination, job insecurity, outness, mental health and burnout, and I'll just say a couple of things around curriculum, outness and care. To start us off, and together this kind of really underlines the particularities of the precariousness we as LGBT plus people working in the higher education sector experience. Now, I will be talking about LGBT plus people, and I have been talking about LGBT plus people. However, we also have data in the survey, including BAME, including disability, including other factors that I will definitely report more on in future work, but don't have the time or space and have not gotten so far in the analysis to go into depth about this here. However, going into the first theme, then we have looked and asked a range of questions around discrimination. And what we find is that when we ask around personal experience discrimination, more than 50% of our respondents have experienced personally discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation or both. We have a higher percentage when we ask around whether or not people have witnessed derogatory references of behavior towards those same categories. I want to highlight that the experiences in terms of derogatory references and behavior are higher when it comes to gender identity and gender expression than with sexual orientation, which might be something important to address in future work. Crucially, when it comes to discrimination, it's not only that we need to think about intersectional discrimination, because some of the comments that we see is that, well, which category do you want me to report on? So it's clear that people who are BAME or have other characteristics experience a whole range of different types of discrimination, and it can be difficult to disentangle, and we could ask if we should. But I think crucially also is that we ask then around the level of confidence people have in reporting derogatory references or discrimination. And whilst most feel some level of confidence in reporting language or discrimination, it was clear that people have lower level of confidence or no confidence in reporting non-binary phobia, non-binary phobic language, biphobic language, than other, so homophobic and transphobic language, which means that there might be something to really address there. If I go down to job insecurity, this really highlights the precariousness of LGBT plus staff. 43% of our respondents are on fixed term contracts, all of which are LGBT plus staff. And we can see also that there are quite a few people who are not only on fixed term contract, but also 75% of the respondents have thought about leaving higher education the last 6 months, and 27% of these do not think they are able to find a new job. Of course, this is something that is linked to COVID, but it'd be interesting to know to what extent this is more highly related to an LGBT plus status. Also importantly, 25% reports that their LGBT plus status affects their promotion negatively. We also spoke and asked people about curriculums and decolonizing curriculums, and it was clear from the responses that although in most places we see that there are initiatives to decolonize curriculums, not all of these, or actually around 40% of these who were focusing on decolonization did not actually. Only 52% of those included gender and sexuality as a subject or being part of decolonization, which I think is interesting to think about. Other than that, we also looked at outness, and although most people are out, there's lots of stories around stresses related to this. Lastly, I wanted to highlight something that is really crucial and huge in terms of numbers that come out. And this is the number of people reporting chronic illness and mental health and burnout amongst our respondents. In our questionnaire, over 80% of our respondents report to have experienced mental health issues or burnout. Now, this is an extremely high number. In addition to that, 40% of the respondents reported to have chronic illnesses. Most of this is reported when asked in detail to be related to mental health diagnosis or status. And I think as a union, this is also something we should think about in terms of actionable policies, but we should also look at this in relation to the larger precariousness and insecurity and environment where discrimination and indirect discrimination exists based on what we have found and what I have mentioned so far. I'm going to leave it there, and yeah, thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Trudeau, very much for that and for sharing those initial results. And hopefully when the survey is rolled out more widely, perhaps more of our companions in the LGBT plus community in HE will be encouraged to take part to give a wider range of data. So I was thinking of a way to try and sum up the contributions today, and it strikes me that some aspects of our oppression are only discovered in the process of achieving liberation. And as our speakers today have illustrated, LGBT plus equality isn't a done deal. It's a work in progress. In that sense, it's good to be positive about the progress that we've made so far, and at the same time, realistic about what remains to be done. And I think, as all the presentations today have underscored, combining a sense of reality with optimism to those challenges in the future can create a clear pathway for activism as we go forward. I hate using that expression, going forward, but there I did. This is our scheduled stop time. We did have some questions planned, so I don't know if I can defer to some of the other organisers here about the best approach to how we wrap things up. I think one possibility perhaps is to take the questions that came in as the premise for perhaps the next in this series of webinars and use that as our jumping off point there. I think that's what
yes, we will have two more this year, two more events this year. One will be the members conference at the beginning of December, and we're also planning one for Trans Awareness Week as well. So there will be opportunities there. Many of the speakers address questions which have already been brought in, so that's fantastic. And we can certainly use this as the launch pad for the rest of the events and into next year too.
Then in that case, perhaps the best way of wrapping up would be just to say again a huge thanks to all of the 6 contributors who've taken part today. Also to Jenny and Seamus who've been signing in BSL, which is really a significant, I think, in including the inclusivity of the event. And also to the organisers behind the scenes, to Seth Atkin, to Jenny Sherrard, and to Vicky Blake for introducing the event, and to UCU for facilitating and supporting this important aspect of the union's equality work. So based on what Seth said, I hope those delegates who've been involved today, who've been watching or perhaps submitted questions, will be encouraged to take part in the 2 upcoming events that Seth mentioned. and we'll look forward to continuing this, I think, very important dialogue and discussion in those events. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here, to the contributors for taking part, to the organisers, to interpreters, everyone who's been involved. Thank you very much.